welcome to this keynote session. And today our keynote is Elena Burgos Martinez. I don't know if my pronunciation is correct or not.
Perfect.
Thank you. And yeah, she will talk about, I will check it first. She will talk about the dehumanizing pandemic subject. Okay, and maybe I will give the floor to you so you can go to explain about it directly. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's not the first time that we share a conference and a panel. So this is Nazaruddin and I met for the first time in person in London at SOAS.
Yeah, in SOAS, I think in 2016, right?
Yeah, long time ago in 2016. And it was such a great connection with him and Wija as well, Wija Yanto. And we had so much fun. So it's such a great thing that you invited me to be here. And you are the moderator of my session. Because we do have a lot in common. We both have studied and researched in small islands of Indonesia. And I think we both have an understanding of things like language and understanding of things like culture. They connect quite a lot. So I think it's easy to be here. And also, thank you so much, Universitas Indonesia, for inviting me to be one of the keynote speakers. It's really an honor on my side. And I have very good memories with you, with the Universitas Indonesia as well, and many members of staff there and students. Since I've been going to Indonesia for research and also giving some public talks.
And I think you came here like 2 years ago,
I
guess. Last year?
No, last summer. Last summer.
Oh, really? Yeah. Last summer you present here also.
Yes, last summer.
Before you went to fieldwork.
Yes, exactly. No, last summer I went only to visit Indonesia again after 5 years since I did my research, and I gave a talk on the maritime humanities at the Depok, the same campus here now. So many good memories, and I wish I could be there in person. That's the thing. And so yeah, the talk that I wanted to share with you today, I think is quite relevant to the topic and to the big conference, the overall conference, which is basically focusing on the humanities and the arts. And the thing throughout this pandemic, these 6 to 9 months that we've been going through this COVID-19 pandemic around the world, one thing that we have constantly needed is to remind ourselves how much pandemics and illnesses dehumanize people, in the sense that they are sort of objectified, and the human dimension of it is often removed from it. And I think the humanities are necessary, are so relevant to pandemics, to the study of pandemics, the study of the approaches to illnesses and health, and approaches to healing as well. So I think this is a very timely conference, and I'm glad that this conference is happening now. It's really good to reflect on COVID-19 and the approaches different countries have had, and the conflicts that it has created, and the inequalities that it has highlighted, which is quite interesting. And what I wanted to say first, so I have a list of contents. First, I'm going to introduce myself a bit more, because some people might not know who I am, and a lot of people will not know who I am. And also, I want to talk after about the humanities and the arts. Why are they so relevant in the world and in today's academia, in all the corners of the academe? And I wanted to talk a bit after about critical literacy. What is critical literacy, and how can we achieve that? And then I wanted to just briefly go through 3 countries that are really important. Spain, obviously, because I'm from Spain, from Granada, in the south of Spain. Some of you might know the Alhambra. And I wanted to talk about Indonesia as well, because it's one of my favorite places in the world, and I've lived there for a couple of years. I've done research, I've made friends. Some people are like family to me. And then I also want to talk about the Netherlands, which is the place where I live now. For the past 3 years, I've been living in the Netherlands. And for the past 3 years, I've been working in the Department of Asian Studies in Leiden. Also the department in which you are doing your PhD as well, and also working as a lecturer. So we are also colleagues now, which is quite nice. And this is an interesting department. It's focused on Asian and Middle Eastern studies, and we are, Nazaruddin and I are in the School of Southeast Asian Studies, so it's quite relevant as well. And then after, I wanted to talk a bit more about the concept of ecoracism and the practices of ecoracism that we have seen in the media as well. And they have been embedded in environmental narratives and environmental discourse. And then at the end, we can draw a few conclusions. So who am I? Some of you might know me from previous lectures that I've given in Indonesia, also at Universitas Indonesia. I usually give them in Indonesian, but I've been back for many, many months already. And then most of my work is in English and in some daily life in Dutch. So I keep forgetting Spanish, I keep forgetting Indonesian when I'm bahasa Indonesia when I'm back. But the moment I go back to Indonesia, it comes quickly back. And then people say that I sound Sulawesian, which is a compliment. They might not say it as a compliment, but to me, it is a compliment. And yeah, most of the languages that I learned from within Indonesia, Bahasa Indonesia and Bahasa Sama, I learned them in Eastern Indonesia, in Sulawesi, the north of Sulawesi, and the islands. So that sticks to me, and I think it's quite nice that people can see that when I talk. I'll show you at the end. And my background, my academic background is quite diverse. I started studying at the university, doing degrees, graduate and postgraduate degrees in the sciences, the earth sciences, geology, for example. Then I went into education, pedagogy, and then I went into linguistics, and then I went into anthropology, and then back into Asian studies again. And I think Indonesia brought me actually to the humanities. I was in the earth sciences, and I went into the social sciences. And it was after my years in Indonesia that I realized how important the humanities were for my research and in general for the world and knowledge. And Indonesia taught me things like the historical continuity of today's policies and today's experiences is really important to consider as well. We sometimes view the world, what is happening today, as an isolated series of events, but they have a continuity in history. And I will talk a bit more about that later on. Indonesia also told me that language is really important. Language is essential. We need to understand not only how languages work, but the very concept of language needs to be challenged and needs to be reconstructed in more diverse terms, not just in standardized Anglophone or Francophone inspired models, but it has to go beyond that. We need to understand language in a diverse way, in the way that many islands where I lived in Indonesia were multilingual, multicultural, multi-religious, and that is not only extremely sophisticated and interesting, but it also makes knowledge, the knowledge that is produced on these islands and around the regions, extremely important for the world. If we are to register diversity and move beyond westernized or so-called Western systems and notions, which are most relevant sometimes in scholarship and in academia, and this has to change. So Indonesia told me a lot about, Elena, you're in the sciences and the social sciences, that is good, but you need to go back to the humanities or go for the first time to the humanities. And as a linguist, it was easy to go into the humanities again. And this is how 3 years ago I started working in Asian studies, in the field of Asian studies. And I've also conducted research in Spain, the UK, the Netherlands. You can ask me in 2 weeks when we have the debate. You can ask me also about my own background if you want to know about different research that I've done in the UK. And right now what I'm more interested in is the concept of sustainability, but beyond westernized or institutionalized notions of, so what does it mean to be sustainable in places and islands, especially across the world? Notions and practices that might not be registered in institutions or formalized, but they are really interesting and important to consider. And as I said already, and I think I keep repeating this constantly, the humanities and the arts as well. Obviously, I'm not so connected to the arts, but the arts are extremely relevant. And I have many colleagues and I've met many students, PhD candidates, who work in the arts, who connect the arts to other fields, and they do extremely interesting work, and they focus on Indonesia as well. And the arts and the humanities both have this inherent natural tendency to be interdisciplinary. What does this mean? Within the humanities, we have many different disciplines. They all work normally together. I mean, it's not always the case, but they normally work together. They have an easy way of connecting from history to linguistics to even anthropology, which is social sciences, but it can also be humanities, to the arts, to design, to architecture, to so many different things. And this happens more naturally than in other faculties that I've seen throughout the years. It's not so natural in the social sciences, for example, and it's definitely not so natural in the earth sciences or in the hard sciences. So I think this feature of the humanities and the arts makes it really, really important in the world, these naturally interdisciplinary tendencies. Another aspect of both the humanities and the arts that make them extremely relevant is the approach, collaborative approach that they have. And this means that we can work within academia, but also beyond academia, and we can work with policymakers, practitioners of several sectors, and people, communities. This is it. It brings a human aspect back into the picture, and this is what we need. And also the humanities and the arts focus on micro histories, macro stories, micro stories, and then transfer them back to understanding the global. So the global is constructed locally, and this is what we need as well in the world to understand things like the pandemic in a more coherent way. We need to start focusing on micro stories, micro experiences, micro knowledge, micro. We assume it's small because it corresponds to a smaller setting, but the relevance is huge, is big. So, and as I said earlier, we need to understand that what is happening today has a continuity in history as well. And a big dimension comes from colonial history, for example, and the impact it had on different countries that were colonized, how different systems and different structures, different institutions that were created back in colonial periods and colonial times still exist nowadays inherently in the countries. And this is important to understand, because we tend to be very critical of countries without understanding where things come from sometimes. And there's a matter of agency that we need to revisit. And of course, language. Nasruddin and I, what can we say? We're linguists in a way, different type of linguists, but we think language is central. We should depart from language and arrive to language all the time. And I think this is, for any language, any languages, this is something very relevant. And now this takes me to the slide on critical literacy. And I was very glad that the Universitas Indonesia and the Faculty of Humanities and this conference invited me to talk on these topics. So what is critical literacy? So the word itself says it already. It's being critical about the things we know, the things we learn, the things we read, the things we hear. And critical literacy can be an interpretive lens. It can be a lens you use, a frame you use to interpret things, to understand things. It can be a pedagogical tool. It can be something you teach in class to graduate and postgraduate students. And it can also be a research methodology. Critical literacy can be used for your own research. It can be your methodology, it can encompass a series of methods that relate to it. It's a framework for analysis as well. And I'm going to show you what critical literacy means in practice. So for example, let's say that you're teaching a course on media analysis, right? Or you're teaching a course to do with the anthropology of something, the anthropology of the environment, something, or political science as well. And then you have a series of newspaper articles, a series of news from media. You have Facebook, you use social networks as well as materials for your course. And then you have also articles that people have written. If you apply the framework of critical literacy as pedagogical tool and as an tool for analysis, you can expose the biases behind the narratives presented on these materials that you have. So the materials that you have always present certain narratives and discourses, right? So if you apply this analysis, you can expose biases. And what is a bias? A bias is a series of values and beliefs that the author behind the pieces, or the authors in plural, hold in their cultural background, in their ideologies, in their anything that relates to them. And they reproduce these biases, and you can see them in between the lines of the things they write, right? I'll give you examples later, so don't panic just yet. And by applying critical literacy, you can also challenge existing powers behind the big narratives, the macro narratives of the world, the micro discourses of the world, narratives of health and illness, narratives of contagion, narratives of protection, of locking down countries. There's always powers behind. Whoever is in power, whatever party, whatever community is in power, will decide, decide and design the narrative. So if you don't agree with the powers, if the powers are not representative of the community, the whole country, or the powers are constantly sort of crafting and using certain narratives to divide people, then you can use critical literacy to oppose to that, to challenge that in an academic way and in a more effective way, I think, than other sort of demonstrations and protests might do. This takes longer. It's more for the long term than immediately, but it's a good tool to sort of challenge a status quo. And critical literacy can also help you denounce the biases that we talked about. You not only expose them and analyze them with your students and discuss what does these biases mean, who's behind these biases, and how do they talk about power, but you can also denounce biases like racist biases, Islamophobic biases, Orientalist biases, that really don't bring anything into the picture and just perpetuate racism, Islamophobia, Orientalism. We don't need that in the world. So we need to actively work against it in academia as well. And sometimes these racist biases are so inherent, they're so much part of institutions, systems, and even policy that we don't even realize. They're everywhere in the world around us, and we don't realize they exist, but we can see them, we can discuss them in class, but also in your research if you apply this type of framework. And critical literacy also approaches the concept of fake news in very critical ways, critical. Fake news are not only conspiracy theories, right? About whether the virus COVID-19 was created in a lab somewhere and it was then, I don't know, thrown around the world for certain countries to fight against each other because of economic gains or power, bipolar world orders and stuff like that. Fake news can also be narratives that construct people as inferior, or narratives that construct people as a problem, certain type of people as a problem, racist biases. These are fake news as well. We need to start redefining the concept of fake news to include narratives, news reporting based on these narratives, and the biases behind the narratives that construct certain groups of people as inferior, as undesired, as to be tamed, as wild, things like that. This is really problematic, and this, for me, are also fake news, and for many of us, not just for me. And I think you might agree with me. Some of you might agree. And critical literacy helps end the polarized approaches to public discourse and public debate. Public debate and public discourse around the world, in the West as well, in the Netherlands, in Spain, in the UK, is extremely polarized. It's extremely polarized. What does this mean? They present two sides to everything, and that's it. And this is not realistic, and it's not fair as well. So you can help criticize the polarization of public debate, and this can happen within academia and through academia as well, as we work with non-academic practitioners and experts in other fields. So this is quite handy. You can also ask me when we have our debate, you can also ask me more about critical literacy. What does it mean? I've defined it in a way, but there's so many different ways to apply it to your courses. So you can always give me examples of courses you are teaching, or courses you're studying, or research that you're doing, and how can I apply critical literacy? And then we can always discuss that as well. And I'm going to briefly talk about the countries that I mentioned before. I included a fourth country on this slide on COVID-19, racism and inequality. This fourth country I included is the UK, the United Kingdom, where I lived for 15 years before moving to the Netherlands, and where I've done most of my postgrad degrees, of my PhDs and everything are from the UK. So I haven't developed the talk in the UK, but you can ask me as well during our debate about the situation in the UK. And now what I'm just going to mention briefly is I'm going to start with the Netherlands, which is where I am right now. And obviously the Netherlands has a very complicated, complex, sophisticated and extensive relation to Indonesia through history. And I think much of the, how to say this without sounding like I'm not suggesting the Netherlands or their colonial administration defined everything in the world through their journeys, but they did impact the massacres, the violence, but also the cultural violence, not just the physical violence, but the cultural violence, the environmental violence, and the linguistic violence that took place during colonial administration. This can also be said about Latin American countries, obviously, from the Spanish colonial administration and around the world. But let's focus now on the Netherlands. Basically, when the colonial administration arrived, they don't just brought violence physically, but they brought a lot of systems and a lot of institutions from the Netherlands, from what wasn't even yet Europe back then, but from the Netherlands and from the countries around. They were foreign to Indonesia. These systems, these institutions did not exist in Indonesia before. And then they sort of imposed them through the violence, physical violence. And this changed a lot of things. And one of the things that the colonial administrations spread around the world was the racial theory, so theorized race, the concept of race as well. And they imposed it in a way that they enslaved certain groups of people when they arrived to Indonesia. And they also chose other groups of people as their allies, right? As the elites, the so-called elites of the areas. And they divided Indonesia in a way that this is very general. Obviously, we can talk about this in more detail. But they divided the West against the East. The East was for them, because it's not what it is for sure, but it was more undeveloped. So they thought the West was more developed and would be more coinciding with them. And they had these ideas of supremacy. They were the progressive, supreme humans of the world, and they had to civilize and emancipate and develop other humans. And this is extremely orientalist. This is extremely racist. This notion of race didn't exist before, but ended up being the case. And after, and this is still, we can see nowadays, as some regions of Indonesia and some people that live in cities, for example, more urban subjects, might consider themselves, this is not always the case, but might consider themselves superior or more exceptional or more connected to the international spheres than others. And this is still existing. I have a student, for example, many students of mine, Indonesian students also, and Dutch and many other nationalities, research things like, for example, the impact of racial theory on current racism against Papua. And for example, one of my students, she's reading archives and she's reading letters exchanged between the Dutch administration during colonial times with the US, some US officials. And in the letters, the US officials are telling the Dutch administration, even though they had a lot of fights among themselves, that Papua could be a really great place for the colonial administration and their allies to move after the independence of Indonesia and create like a sort of paradise-like living in which the Papuans will be their slaves because they are not clever enough to have their own society, to govern their own society, so they can easily turn into slaves. So on these letters, you see the deep racism and the deep orientalism of the paradigms used by these people. They have inherited these paradigms. They have also digested these paradigms. They don't even realize. They maybe thought they were doing even good things. And this is still existing today, on the way people see Papuans, in the way they see. So it's like historical continuity. And if we talk about things like, for example, palm oil and the conflicts with land grabbing and the struggles of the small farmers, the small holders, this also has a continuity to history, to how colonial administration introduced certain policies about land ownership, going back to the state, and notions of environment and notions of land and notions of labor, notions of many different things that relate to it. And today we can see the impact of that. I mean, you can compare 400 years of colonization with 75 years of independence. Countries need time to get rid of all the damage that was done. It wasn't just physical, it was also cultural, linguistic, and environmental. So we need to be a bit more understanding. And this is what I didn't see during COVID-19. I was reading media in Indonesian, in English, in Dutch, and in Spanish on COVID-19, the pandemic, and especially prevention and lockdowns, for example. Those were the topics that interest me a lot. And well, the Netherlands, for example, had a really, really, really difficult start with the pandemic and rejected it and sort of ignored it completely and thought the Netherlands were exceptional, Europe was exceptional and will never happen to them, and ignored what was happening in China along Orientalist lines, so thinking it's just the Chinese being, themselves, and this is never going to happen to us. So this assumption of being exceptional was always present, and then the population here in the Netherlands, including myself and my friends and my partner and family and everything, we were all confused. What is happening? Are we really in danger? Is anything going to happen, or is it not? What is that? So the information that was given to us was really, really confusing. Suddenly we were told this is just like influenza, so just go to the streets. And then we were told, no, wait, it might actually be a pandemic. So all contradicting speeches and news were confusing us. But this was really criticized in international press. And I thought, okay, the international press was more focusing on China and talking about China and Chinese subjects in a very orientalist way, obviously, as if the pandemic was something they had coming because they are weird in themselves. The cultures are weird. The culinary traditions, the things they eat is weird, very orientalist biases behind their approach. They were focusing so much on that they forgot to be critical about the Netherlands, for example, or Spain as well. and I'll talk briefly about Spain in a little while. And but we needed that critique to sort of wake up, no? And there were things like, as we became more aware of the pandemic being present also in Europe, people started, the government in the Netherlands started crafting a sort of a contingency plan or strategy to battle or to fight the pandemic and to protect ourselves from the pandemic. There was just catering for the powerful, the corporations, the businesses that brought money, like KLM, the airlines, and the solvent members of society, but completely ignore the poor, the homeless, people with lack of access to daycare, who have big families with kids, job precarity as well, people on temporary contracts, people unemployed people. They completely ignore those agents of society. They just focus on the middle classes, the upper middle classes, the solvent, the corporations, the businesses. And this was, again, not criticized in international press. And I was like, come on, we need that criticism. What is it? And then it took time, and there's a slide in which I cut pasted the article in case you want to read it in more detail. It took time for people to start writing things, and this is a Dutch writer, Pepijn Brandon, who lives in the US. Of course, Dutch people living in the US or in other countries did take it to the media to be critical about their own countries, but it seems to be difficult when you are a Dutch person that lives in their own country. It doesn't seem to be as common to be critical of your own government. And but this author, for example, wrote an article called "Neoliberal Dogmatism: Coronavirus and the Survival of the Fittest." So that's what we saw in the Netherlands. The fittest were the kings of the queens of the country, and the rest were just floating around in uncertainty. And this was very problematic. The Netherlands is a very neoliberal system, very much focused on the economy and the market-driven. And if your sector, like my partners, for example, who is a singer, a tenor, the cultural sector doesn't give so much money to the economy, then the cultural sector is unprotected and ignored. And eventually became protected, but it took a lot. But then, so while the Netherlands sort of escaped the critique for a good chunk of the first months, within Europe, Spain, Italy and Spain were roughly, they were ruthlessly criticized by Northern European countries. So we saw the divide north and south of Europe, which is a constructed divide. It's not really present in daily life as much, but although you see it through some forms of domestic racism as well. But we saw this divide coming back to the forefront. So Northern European countries were criticizing Southern European countries for being too messy in their finances, for being too unprepared for the pandemic, for being the plague spreader of the pandemic because it came through Italy. And they did this in different times. So Spain had to deal, from the beginning, it had to deal a lot with criticism coming already from other European countries, mostly Northwestern European countries, like the Netherlands, the UK, which is Europe, and Germany, for example, and France, on and off. And Spain was already trying to please the international community, please Europe, please be somebody. It's always trying, Spain, mostly the government and foreign affairs ministers and experts always try to please the international community, and they feel that they never do it enough. And focusing on the politics of that, it also means the time to be coherent about its own inequalities, how to protect people in sectors, professional sectors that are not properly protected, in job precarity and things like that, or how to take care of the homeless, the poor, the disabled people who might not get the care or the help that they need during a period like this. So it missed completely the opportunity to tackle once more the existing inequality of the country, occupied with pleasing the rest of Europe, with showing power, with being powerful. And also, what happened as well is because the governments were occupied with that, they lost track of what was happening in the different autonomous communities of Spain. And there's a long history that we also have to understand when we talk about COVID-19 in Spain, of a confrontation between different autonomic regions because of history as well, and the civil war, obviously, confronting different people and different factions. And it's understandable. I mean, Spain has 4 different languages and 1 dialect, and it's not a dialect of Spanish, it's a dialect of Catalan, Valencia. And in the south of Spain, where I'm from, for example, our history is more related to Africa, to North Africa and the Middle East as well, through centuries of Islamic culture and architecture and history. And it's also diverse, but it's not handled. Diversity is not properly handled in a way. So this could be seen critically. And you can ask me more details. I don't want to focus on Spain so much, but you can ask me more details when we meet in 2 weeks to debate. And one thing I saw a lot in Spain, and this is through private recordings that I got sent by colleagues and friends, was the orientalizing of COVID-19. So medical experts, doctors, and other health workers went straight away into this xenophobia. Xenophobia is phobia and hate and racism against Chinese people. It can also be applied to other Asian countries, but it's mostly to do with Chinese people. And they bought into that immediately. I mean, I received recordings where doctors were telling the audiences, the public, things like, well, you know, in China, these viruses have always been common because they eat weird things and they eat wild animals they shouldn't be eating. And now because they opened to the world since the 90s, they're spreading it around the world. How problematic is that? How racist? How xenophobic is that? And then I thought about Spain. I thought, well, Spain has a long history of eating wild animals through hunting. So how can you not see that in your own practices and see it somewhere else? And also the people who were talking about China this way had no knowledge whatsoever about Chinese culture, Chinese culinary traditions, Chinese human-animal interactions. They had no idea. So they were just speculating based on their own digests from the media and from institutions in Spain, racism and xenophobia. So that was really, really problematic. And I wrote, there's an article on, if you want to read a bit more about Spain and the Netherlands, I wrote one of the articles that I wrote during COVID-19, the pandemic, being locked down in my house, was towards a COVID-19 lexicon of conceptual offshoots, locking sociality down in the Netherlands and Spain. And this talks about how the Netherlands and Spain use certain vocabulary to frame and define the lockdown. They sort of reflected these ideas of exceptionalism, of inferiority, of orientalism, and of racism. So you can maybe read a bit more about it if you're interested. And it brings me to Indonesia, which I wanted it to be more the focus of the talk, but I always run later than I should, but forgive me for that. Indonesia, so with COVID-19, it took, media was focusing on China, then it went to Europe and the US, UK, and then it went back to Asia, and then started focusing more on Indonesia and other Asian countries as well. And the amount of criticism that I've seen, I mean, it's good to be critical about our own countries, don't get me wrong, and it's good to be active and to express it, to write, to have what the people call freedom of speech, which is always very politicized as well, of course. But it's good to do that. But what I saw made me really upset, and I wrote an article about it after. I saw that there were levels of criticism against Indonesia from the international press that we had never seen regarding the Netherlands. And what was happening was a bit similar to the Netherlands. And I always make jokes saying maybe Jokowi is talking to Rutte. No? They're having some conversations because they do have some contact. And Indonesia also seeks to inspire itself by looking at other countries internationally. So I thought maybe there's sort of trends that come from that, inspired by other countries. But all the criticism that I hadn't seen in the Netherlands about the Netherlands, I was seeing in the Netherlands about Indonesia. And I was like, well, this might respond as well to the exacerbated critique of Asian countries, might respond to Europe and to the Netherlands and other countries like the US, for example, also, legitimizing their neo-colonial biases again through this critique. So this intense critique that has not been applied to their own context first, or that also doesn't depart from understanding the historical continuity of what is happening nowadays, or the historical continuity of what they are thinking about these other countries nowadays. So this is the interesting thing. And what I saw in Indonesia was also that in the beginning there was a bit of denial. It's not really happening, it's not important in this regard, we need the economy to thrive, we need the economy to keep going. And then I saw a focus on certain people in communities as the culprits. So the poor are spreading the virus. It's just because we're too many people, it's just because these places are massified, it's just because of some traditions and some tendencies that some people have. I saw these discourses in Indonesia, and it made me really sad, obviously, to see that. I recognized it from other countries as well. I saw similar things in the Netherlands when they put the blame on the spreading the illness on the Turkish Dutch and the Moroccan Dutch, who are Dutch people but from Moroccan and Turkish backgrounds. And those were people who had this background were scrutinized daily in daily life. That's really Islamophobic and racist. And I saw similar things with Indonesia. And I was like, oh, come on, how can you maybe, the thing with Indonesia is really good at deconstructing itself, at being reflective and being critical about itself, maybe not so much in the government, although it does happen every now and then, but more in civil society. The civil societies of Indonesia, India, and other Asian countries are something we should learn from. They're extremely powerful, they're extremely active, they're extremely resourceful and connected. So this is incredible. But I could see that as well, the disregard for the diversity. Indonesia, one of the biggest strengths of Indonesia is its diversity. I mean, this is what brought me to Indonesia, is diversity of cultures and languages, which definitely does not define Indonesia as a weak nation. It defines it as a strong nation of connected diversities. And I think this is pretty interesting. And there's a wealth of knowledge in Indonesia, dealing with the pandemic, dealing with COVID-19. There was a wealth of knowledge around the small islands, rural settings, that was disregarded completely in policy, and more in favor of homogeneous elitist discourse. And I have a slide, and I wrote a little bit about it. There's an article by me, there's an article by Benny Bascara, and we both wrote a bit about how the experiences and the approaches of the Bajo people, for example, on islands in the northeast of Indonesia or in the southeast of Indonesia, but this can also be applied to other communities, not just the Bajo, but many different local communities across Indonesia, had really interesting ways of dealing with COVID-19 that came from their own knowledge, from their own traditions, their own history, their own indigenous knowledge and healing, concepts of healing and approaches to healing. And some scientists might tell and say things like, well, yeah, but you can't heal or you can't prevent COVID-19 by using traditional healing medicine. Why not? Depending on the context, some people might definitely not deal well with it, but other people will. And in my article that I wrote for the Islam blog of Leiden University, I talk about how there's a lot of narratives of successful dealing with COVID-19 and isolation, coming from islands like Line Island in Sulawesi Utara. And these stories of success have been ignored by the media, not only the international press, but also nationally. And what Nine Island did, for example, they isolated as an island, as a community, they closed up themselves. And they went on with life, and they have a history of doing that when different colonial powers came around the islands, but also when every year they get the dengue fever, the seasonal dengue coming to Manado, and they also sort of isolate the island to be able to still fish and still be able to teach and to conduct prayers and to continue with their daily life. And these stories were really interesting. And Benny, in his article, he talks about how certain people saw the Bajo as disregarding measures, disregarding regulations, and ignoring the COVID-19 pandemic and just doing their own thing and keep on socializing. But this is actually a racist perspective, and it's also a sort of domestically racist approach to people. First, understand, why do people do the things they do? It might not be challenging the government. It might not be challenging the capital, and their practices. It might just be a way that they are sort of protesting against the way they're being constructed by the capital or by governments, local, regional governments, as well as developed as backwards, because they are not. They have just different cultures. And if you don't understand the basis of their behavior, of the challenging of these measures, then you can't understand what is going on, really. So critique has to be based on understanding. And the same about Nine Island. Nine Island had no cases of COVID-19, and I know this. So people might say, but there was no testing. How do you know? Well, I was sort of in contact with them constantly through the internet, and we knew the number of deaths. And the number of deaths, because the funerals on Nine Island are really big events, and quickly you have to bring the dead to the graveyard, and this is like a gathering, and it's always posted on Facebook, on a Facebook group for the island. And the amount of deaths, the elderly who died were the same as every year. So there wasn't an increase in deaths or an increase in anything. And Nine Island inhabitants never hide deaths or anything like that. So that goes against their nature. So there was not a change observed in the amount of the demographics of the island. So that tells me a lot without testing, that COVID-19 probably didn't have a big impact on the island. So a lot could be learned from the way an island isolates as a community, not necessarily individually, but as a community, because how can you isolate individually on an island? You need to get your food every day. You need to go out of the house on the stilts to the pavement, to the street, in the mountain, and also to school and things. You can't really isolate in the same way that you do on the cities and in the same way on the island. So we need to be understanding of that. And it was pretty successful on Nine Island. So it doesn't mean it leads to failure And what Benny wrote, we need to be aware of why people are being perceived in certain ways. What are the biases behind the perceptions of people, the governments, institutions, and ourselves as citizens might have? What are how we inherited these biases through media, through school even? They are present in institutions. Do we need to challenge them to understand what people do, to understand how the diversity of a country can benefit the country and a lot? And this is something. And I'm going to switch quickly, but you can still ask me much more about it when we meet in 2 weeks. But I'm gonna switch a bit to ecoracism and environmental discourse. And this connects to what I discussed about the Bajo as well, the island. The island is a different environment. Small islands are different environments from cities, from highlands, from any other type of environment. And we know that, but we're still treated in the same way. Or even so, we treat it in ways that don't correspond to the systems of the environment. And we saw that a lot in during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm gonna have a sip of water. We saw that a lot. We saw that the way in which the illness and the viruses, as they are zoonotic and transfer from animals, from wild animals like bats and others to humans, the attention was put in whether certain type of humans were doing things wrong and compromising the environment, compromising the world, the globe. You know, think big macro narratives of environmental degradation and environmental healing, coming from Western countries especially, and coming from people who had adopted Westernized or Western-related values about the environment. And then every time that I heard and I read, we humans destroy the world, we humans degrade the environment, we humans kill animals. And I kept thinking, who is we humans? We have this tendency to use we humans, and this is something the critical literacy can help you challenge it and unpack. Who is we humans? If we keep saying we humans, we are obscuring the real critique that we need to be having. The real critique that is not about culinary models or ethnocentric critiques of culinary traditions or othering certain groups of people in discourse. What we should be talking about is the violence of certain consumption, mass consumption patterns that exist in the world. And like I said before, we should be discussing the historical continuity of today's environmental degradation, for example, and the profitable and violent nature of commodity chains and global consumption. And this is not happening. And we should be also talking about things like put the labor of the smallholder farmers at the center of the debate, their struggles, how they are stuck in these chains of mass consumption and global demand of certain animals as well. And they can't really deal with this business. Some have to buy into these consumption patterns. Some opposed to them, but they don't have any leverage, any power. And we need to stop talking about the forest, the sea, the island as wilderness, as something to be tamed and emancipated and developed by the urban. That's not the case. The urban has its own knowledges. The urban can also be deconstructed. It's very diverse, but it has its own knowledges, and we need to learn from each other. We need to learn from also the forest, the sea, the island. What do things mean there? And we need to focus on the more than human collaboration that is present in the world, and more humanized approaches to labor, consumption, illness, health, and healing, instead of putting the blame on sort of endemic culinary models and traditions that exist in a place. That never happens. It's not an isolated experience. It comes from something else. It's connected to something else. So if a Western academic or a non-Western academic considers that consuming bats is immoral and is bad for the globe and the environment, instead of criticizing groups of people and individuals in an orientalist racist way, try to understand where that comes from, try to understand whether really this community consuming bats is really destroying the world, which is not the case, or what destroys the world is a systematic violence of consumption chains and labor and extractive industries, of course. This is what we should be talking, systems, not we humans in the world, and a world that is sort of created as a third person entity, nature, that is devoid of human. No, the world, nature, and us, we are all the same. We are all connected. There's a more than human collaboration in daily life, even in the cities. You can see it everywhere. So we need to focus more on that. And I included a caption in one of the slides of a really nice article from the Society for Cultural Anthropology that is called "Seeing Indigenous Land Struggles in the Multi-Species Cloud of COVID-19." this article by Will Smith, which is not the actor that we all know from the series, but an academic, and Noah Theriault talks about the Philippines. But I think what they talk about relates a lot to Indonesia as well, and seeing how the sort of multi-species cloud and discussions that have been had around the world about COVID-19 have missed the opportunity again of putting land struggles and sea struggles, not just land. Everything tends to be a lot of terra-centric and land-centric, and I think we need to talk in the case of Indonesia and the Philippines as well about the sea a lot and the coast, and put these struggles at the forefront, because a lot of it comes from it, not from individuals consuming bats or pangolins, but from the illegal as well, trading of certain animals and the demand that exists in the world, not just in Asia, outside Asia as well. So we need to move on from all these orientalist biases and the tiring racist stereotypes to more coherent topics to discuss. And I've included a few more references. I think I'm coming to the end to draw some conclusions. And I included references. I wrote an extensive article on ecoracism and COVID-19, which I have a link on a slide you can read. And another one on international press, orientalist and xenophobic approaches to COVID-19 in Asia. You can read both later on if you have anytime, if you feel like it. And just to draw a few concluding thoughts, right? What have we sort of discussed in this talk? We have discussed many things, and we can expand. And I accept questions, I welcome questions from anyone in 2 weeks that wants me to talk in more detail about any of the things that I said. And I also talk really fast, so you can also ask me if any of the concepts that I mentioned or any of the experiences or the case studies need more details. But we live in a world where inequality and racism cause more deaths every day and every second than any virus. So studying viruses is good, and we need that as well to prevent it, to heal, to sort of know what we're dealing with. But we need to stay focused, and also look at the racism behind the way a virus or a pandemic is constructed, and also look at the inequalities the pandemic highlights. And these inequalities existed from before; they are not new to the pandemic. The pandemic is an opportunity to discuss them in relevant terms. And existing orientalist, racist, Islamophobic bias operate in daily discourses, even in our discourses sometimes, and they help maintain the status quo of powers, current powers, that we might not want that. So we need to be aware how maybe ourselves, because I used to see this in myself many years ago, we perpetuate certain biases through the type of work we do, through the type of approaches we take. So critical literacy can help you deconstruct and reflect about your own research as well, in your own classes, the way you teach, the things you teach. And in the academe, the way you'd like to call it, the ivory tower, which is not so ivory for some of us, we like to see it as a more practical place where we can actually become activists as well in a coherent way. And the humanities and the arts are central to the intellectual power of activism. So we really need to work within the humanities and the arts and exploit in a positive way, not in an extractive way, like we said before, but exploit the tendencies to be collaborative, the tendencies to be interdisciplinary. I think this is really useful. And the critical study of inequality is definitely an academic pursuit. It's not just a hobby or something you do on the side because you're an activist as well. No, it's part of the academia. The academic and the activist come together. They're not divided in many ways. And one thing I said that I want to repeat, because a lot of people forget, fake news is not just Trump telling us random things that don't make any sense, or news that are fake, not based on factual events. Fake news is also narratives and constructions of people demonizing, vilifying countries and people based on Orientalism and racism and Islamophobia as well. So this is also fake news. And we need to be aware of them. They are everywhere. In our institutions, in our governments, in our academia, everywhere. And we might even be digesting them and consuming them without realizing it through media, through different things we consume. Books as well. Books can also have Orientalist biases. And so be critical. And the international and national presses of the world and supranational institutions and organizations have been empowered during the whole COVID-19 pandemic to define, to conceptualize the pandemic themselves. So, and they can also be biased. Institutions and supranational organizations are definitely biased as well. So they have sort of helped without wanting, maybe it wasn't conscious, but they have helped dehumanize people throughout the pandemic, and we need to be critical about them as well. And that's it for today. I think I've talked more than 30 minutes, but as I said before, I welcome any questions they ask me to develop on the things I said, the concepts, the case studies, and I have a final slide with my email as well if you want to email me. I also welcome emails, and it would have been lovely to be there and have a chat. But terima kasih banyak. Minta tolong kasih pertanyaan tanggal 30 September atau via email.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, this is interesting, and I like that I still put the highlight here that the humanities and the art is the central. So this is quite strong one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And well, me myself actually might have some questions to discuss as well, but maybe we can keep it until the 30th of September.
We can do.
Yeah.
It's up to you. I'm happy also to, because you're my moderator, I'm happy to discuss with you if you want a couple of things, and then we can leave questions for the audience.
Yeah, especially related to how these kinds of how the critical literacy play some role in this post-truth era, for example, because like here in Indonesia, the fake news and hoax and everything play a big role in confusing people about these pandemic things. Okay.
Yes. No, also in the Netherlands as well. I mean, I see it also in Indonesia, obviously, but I see it a lot in the Netherlands and in Spain. Fake news about whether the virus is important or not, whether it's happening or not, whether it's increasing numbers or not, have been present throughout the world. And I think we need to be aware that the governments and media are catering for certain audiences. So they have to please the big businesses, the corporations, the economy. They have to look for the economy. And this is why they keep constructing different approaches to the numbers and different approaches to the illness as long as they can. And they do it in different ways, different countries. So through critical literacy basically means listening to news, reading news, listening to people, reading things people write in a critical way, in a way that you already think, okay, this piece of information comes from an author, there's people behind, and these people might have certain values, beliefs, interests, agendas, and this is why they frame things the way they do. And then you can, especially if you read pieces of news that talk about certain groups of people, like for example, I don't know, the Chinese, which is a massive country, there's many different people, the Chinese as the threat in the world, or things like that, or the poor as the plague spreader, then you immediately know there's a racist and orientalist, depending where it comes from, bias behind. So critical literacy is such an interesting methodology, because if you depart from that, you're deconstructing already even your own research from the moment you begin. Now you think, okay, so what are my beliefs about this focus, this place?
Indeed, and also the role of language itself in communicating the pandemic, especially in Indonesia.
Exactly.
Because we have like more than 700 languages, so it must be we need different way to approach.
So this is really important. I mean, Indonesia is such a wealth linguistically and culturally, which is what attracted me to Indonesia many years ago, and what attracts many people towards Indonesia. There's a wealth of the linguistic wealth. I mean, islands of 5 square kilometers, like 9 islands, have 3-4 different languages. I mean, I was overwhelmed, like all this knowledge is here. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, the way we define health, illness, and healing is very relative. You can't define it in one way, institutionalized it in the government or in media, and then that's what everybody should adopt. It means different things. And here, what I saw, for example, the notions of health and illness that Turkish and Moroccan Dutch people had were always infantilized, because there's a huge Islamophobia in society. They were infantilized. Oh, yes, the Muslim people being like this and that. We just need to convince them that the ways that we do things, that the Protestant or the atheist ways that we do things are the right ones. And I found such a problematic thing in this. The languages of Dutch and Moroccan, Turkish and Moroccan Dutch, they were speaking in Dutch as well, which is a different type of Dutch, in a way influenced by Arabic as well. And it's such an interesting way they were defining things in different way, but you never saw that in media, and you never saw that in the press.
And well, this is getting interesting. So,
yes,
but we still need
yeah.
to save it until the 30th of September. Okay.
Yes. Okay. So let's do something. On the 30th of September, we can get questions from anyone who's interested in case study, but we can especially talk about critical literacy, the role of language, and biases behind it, and why is language so important. Shall we?
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thanks to you. No, thanks to you and Regina for being so supportive and so helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
See you
30th.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Ya.
Hati-hati ya.
Hati-hati juga.
Dia udah bye soalnya. Udah, please bye.